it's very important. We've got some people over here that don't have tickets, 2 girls, so if somebody could go and get them. All right, so what I want to say is we are just so thrilled to have this women's breakfast and to be with all of you. It's been wonderful putting this together. Keep your arms up so we can tell who needs a ticket and who doesn't. Who has a ticket? Thank you. All right. We're going to start breakfast, and on the menu is French toast casserole, vegetable frittata, sausage, and then of course you've had your fruit and everything. So what we're going to do is start with this table here. If you want to get up and go down here, I'd appreciate it. And the girls, these girls here will follow you. Over here, we're going to start with this table and go first. And we're going to go this way.
ChrisComiskey, who is the past president of the Georgetown Historical Society and continues to serve on their board of directors. Chris does wonderful cemetery tours in the fall. There's a spooky one at Halloween that we've done before with my family. It was very fun. And she's just has a wealth of information, so I know you're really going to enjoy this presentation. We're very glad to have you. Is there anything else we need to tell people while we have them?
No, just that, you know, we're very welcoming you, and we're very, very pleased to have you here. And
I'm going to turn the lights off at that point. So if anybody needs to run to the bathroom, you may want to circle around to the side since we're now taking up this space. Chris has a microphone which she'll use. But what I'm saying is, while Chris is doing the presentation, if anybody needs to run out, you know, maybe go around the side so you don't trip over the cords, since I've now made this obstacle path. And is there anything after the breakfast now that we're
after the breakfast, yes, you all have a ticket. So we, at Friends of Council on Aging, we have a door prize for you, and it's like this. It's a good size. We also have one person from each table will be taking home the centerpiece as well. So let's have. All right, there you go.
And that would be me.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? Oops, I don't want to quite get that feedback. Everyone hear me okay? Yes. All right. Well, as I said, I'm ChrisComiskey. I've been doing cemetery tours for a number of years now. I do a Halloween cemetery tour every October. And from time to time, I also do historic cemetery tours in Union and Harmony cemeteries. Well, the nice thing about doing a slideshow type tour is I can do both cemeteries. So what I'm going to do this morning is just tell you a little bit about some of the early cemeteries and stones, and then just talk about, seeing I don't have a full hour or so to talk, I'm just going to talk about a few of the interesting characters that are in a couple of our cemeteries. Okay? And if anyone has questions, just raise your hand. So we're going to start off with a little bit about the early gravestones. If you visit Union Cemetery, we have some very old gravestones there, and most of them, the earliest ones, look very much like this. The top part is the tympanum. We have on the side the shoulder, side border, and the tablet, which is where the inscription is written. And most of the earliest gravestones, particularly from the 1700s and early 1800s, have that same shape. Okay, turn it down a little bit. The earliest graves were often marked with a headstone and a footstone. You can see that there. And they usually faced southeast. And the reason for that is these people were very devoutly religious, and they believed that at the end of days, Christ was going to rise up in the east, and all his believers and followers would rise up to greet them. Yes, rise out of the graves and rise up to see him. So they all wanted to face east, so they would see Christ coming again. And the most desirable section of the graveyard was considered the southeast section, because they'd have the best view. It's front row seats, if you want to say that. So this is typical of early graves. You very seldom see many footstones now. Most of them have fallen down or been removed because people mow the grass. They're just in the way, and people trip over them. But we do have a few left, and this is one such one in Union Cemetery. The earliest gravestones that we have here in town date back to mostly the 1700s, but the earliest gravestones you find 1600s to 1700s mostly have some sort of skull type creepy motif on them. This is the winged skull, also called death's head. You see the skull face, and they would have wings. And if you walk through any early cemeteries, you will see grave after grave after grave with variations on the skull, because they were rather obsessed with death, the Puritans. They kept reminding you, you're going to die, you're going to die. A little later on, the soul effigies came along. They're similar, but you get away from the skull shape, and some people call them kind of jack-o'-lantern looking. You can see, this guy looks kind of like he's having fun. And then you have these ones here, still not a very human-looking face, but we're getting away from the creepy skull. And that was going more into the 1700s. We have a number of those in Union Cemetery, too. In the later 1700s and early 1800s, you can see gravestone carving is getting more advanced. There's much more detail to the stones. We have portrait stones. We have much more human-looking faces now, as you can see. This is my favorite one. She's so pretty. This one, I don't know if you can see. She's cross-eyed. I don't know if she was in real life, but she's cross-eyed on her stone. And we often see memento mori. Remember death. They were charming. They just wanted, and also on epitaphs, they would frequently remind you, I'm in the ground now, but your turn's coming. They were a fun group. So we often see memento mori on there, as well as creepy epitaphs, which I'll get into. By the mid-1800s, the Greek influence is coming around. You'll see it in architecture. This is when pillars started showing up. We have the building on the corner of Elm Street, the big pillars on it. That was built around that time. And so the Greek influence shows up on the gravestones, too. If you walk through Union Cemetery, through the section that was purchased in 1805, you will find stone after stone after stone with variations of the weeping willow and the urn. The weeping willow represents the living who are weeping over the departed, and the urn represents, of course, the departed. And no, they were not cremated. They were buried in caskets back then. It's just a representation. And then we come to the Victorian era when anything goes. It's just all about how fancy can I make it. We had the obelisks became very popular, and generally the taller the stone, the more important somebody thought that this departed person was, or it was a representation of their wealth. Everybody wanted a taller stone than the next guy. We also had white marble, became very, very prominent. This is the grave of Reverend Isaac Raymond in Union Cemetery. It's a pulpit, and it's got a Bible on top. And this other one over here, that is Reverend Charles Beecher, also minister. He's over in Harmony. And very beautiful white marble graves. Trouble with white marble, depending on the grade, is it was soft and didn't hold up very well to New England weather. Some of our white marble graves, very beautiful, but you can barely read the writing anymore on them, including Reverend Raymond. You can still read it pretty well, except on the top. The Bible on the top used to have words, and they're almost completely wiped out now. And this is what happens to marble, to give you an idea. Lambs were a very popular choice for children's graves. And you can see this poor lamb just doesn't have any features on its face anymore. They've all just worn away. And that's what happens to the poorer quality white marble. It just doesn't stand up well. Meanwhile, we have slate stones from the 1700s which are still perfectly clear. They haven't worn at all. It's all about what you choose. Oh, and marble was also a popular choice during Victorian times, so that stood up better. But then, of course, if you get fine quality marble, like the fine Italian white marble chosen for John Purley's grave, that's stood up very nicely, and it was just washed, I think, in the last year or so it looks quite beautiful. John Purley was a wealthy man, left a lot of money to charity, to He left money to build this school, and also left a lot of money to a couple of churches for the poor of good habits. No drunks, no drunks. He made that very clear. Nobody who drank. He was a temperance man. So he has this beautiful, fine Italian monument made to him, and if you go around, it tells all the wonderful things he's left his money to. And it doesn't get any more absurd, I think. I'm sorry, it's an absurd gravestone, I think. It's just so incredibly over the top, but it is very, very beautiful and very unusual for a little town like Georgetown to have such an incredibly ornate stone in their cemetery. And then we have epitaphs. I was telling you about, they like to remind you, you're going to die too. This is one that I use for my Halloween cemetery tour. Death is a sentence passed on all. By his fatal stroke, you soon must fall. Repent of sin, if happy you would be. Prepare for death, for you must follow me. And in my cemetery tour, I have this fellow helps me on our cemetery tours, and he his long bony finger, and you have to follow him at that point. That's my son. I can't get close to my computer. Okay, I'm going to talk about a few of the stones in the cemetery. I hear somebody ringing. Okay, we have the oldest stone in the cemetery is Hannah Brocklebank Nelson. She died in 1732. Now, that was around the time that Georgetown, well, not Georgetown, but the Rowley split in two from Rowley East Parish and Rowley West Parish. And so Joseph Nelson, when his wife died, decided rather than go all the way over to Rowley to bury her, he was just going to plant her right in his field. So he buried her across the street from his house. And a few more people died, and he said, yeah, why don't you bury them over by Hannah? And so 1734, the parish finally got around to saying, we need to have our own cemetery. So the logical choice was Joseph Nelson's plot, because he already had several people buried in it. So Hannah is the first person that was buried in Union Cemetery. I think I said Harvey, I meant Union. It says, here lies buried the body of Hannah Nelson, ye wife of Mr. Joseph Nelson, who died June ye 5th, 1732, in ye 48 year of her age. That is on the tablet. But then you notice we have writing down below here. It says, granddaughter of Captain Samuel Brocklebank of Rowley, who was slain by the Indians at Sudbury, April 21st, 1676, and the first person buried in this place. Well, that's kind of a weird thing to have on a gravestone, was what my first impression was when I saw that, because it's nothing like what you usually see. Usually it's just what's on the tablet here. Well, it turns out that this plaque was added about mid-1800s by Hannah's great-great-grandson, who was a genealogist and wrote a book about the Nelson family, and he thought that was something important that should be on her stone, so he had that added to the stone many years later. We have Reverend James Chandler. He was buried in the most desirable southeast section of the graveyard. Remember I said that was the best view there. And it even talks about the coming of the end of days on his epitaph. It says, beneath the honors of this tomb, we've placed our pastor's dear remains to rest in silence here till the last trumpet shall be blown by the Eternal's high command to bid the world draw near. Then will he wake to sweet surprise and join the saints above the skies to sing and triumph there. So that's what I was talking about, how you want a front row seat in the southeast section, so you're the first one to see Christ rise up. So this is an unusual gravestone. It's the only one of this type in any of our cemeteries. It's a box type, slate on top, granite on the bottom. He is buried 6 feet under like everybody else. Some people wonder if he's in the tomb part. No, he is not. He's as deep as everyone else. Very nice grave. Reverend Chandler was the first minister of what is now the First Congregational Church. It was at that time the Second Church of Christ in Rowley. He became the minister in 1732 and remained the minister until his death in 1789. He was, along with being a minister, he was an expert fruit grower, so people came to him for advice on growing things as well as the things that you would ask a minister for advice on normally. And he was also a slave owner. which was not unusual in those days, particularly wealthier people and ministers. A lot of them owned slaves, and he had 2 slaves, Phyllis and Sabina. And we have, speaking of slaves, we have Cuffy Dole. To see people have heard of Cuffy Dole.
Yes.
You've probably heard some things about Cuffy that aren't correct. He is a former slave and a Revolutionary War soldier, and he is buried in the least desirable northwest section of the graveyard. And here's the thing, he always has been. There is an old story about him being buried outside of the cemetery. It is not true. He has always been in the cemetery, but in the northwest section, which is where they would bury the slaves, the paupers, anyone who was considered lower in social standing in the town. So Cuffy has always been in the cemetery. Excuse me. His gravestone reads, "A respectable man of color died rejoicing in the Lord, August 17th, 1816, age 73. AET is a Latin abbreviation meaning in the year of his age. And the epitaph is, "White man, turn not away in disgust. Thou art my brother, like me, akin to earth and worms." Now, there's something, some of you may know, I wrote a book about Cuffy some years ago, and there was something that I missed then. And that was on the very bottom, is covered by grass. We have the engraver of the stone in marble, Georgetown. Well, Georgetown wasn't Georgetown until 1838. Cuffy died in 1816. So that stone could not have been put in till 1838 or later. Why would somebody put in a stone for somebody decades after his death? Well, here's a hint. The Anti-Slavery Society of Georgetown was established in December of 1837. So people are thinking about the slaves, and somebody in town said, "Oh, I remember this story about Cuffy Dole," and they wrote the story about Cuffy Dole, and somebody, probably the Anti-Slavery Society, I don't know, decided to put up a grave for Cuffy. So this was put up during the anti-slavery movement, the start of the anti-slavery movement here in town. Benjamin and Joseph Little, they were affectionately known around town as Uncle Ben and Uncle Joe. And they played a very important role in Georgetown becoming Georgetown. These 2 brothers came to Rowley, West Parish, and set up a little shop in the place known as the Brocklebank Museum now, which at that time was owned by Paul Nelson. And they ran a store there, and they did a really good business. They were good businessmen. And they eventually decided to move out and start their own store. So they moved to what we now know is the center of town. Back then, the center of town was down where the museum is. But they opened a shop there, and built their houses there, and then they opened a post office, and they opened a bank, and then they started to attract other business people that they knew, encouraging them to move to Rowley West Parish and start their businesses there. And so eventually, Rowley West Parish became quite a booming little business community. Whereas the east part of Rowley had their own downtown, but it was very much a farming community over there. So it became like 2 separate towns. There was East Rowley, the farming community, they're known for their pumpkins. They were called pumpkins. And then the west part of Rowley, which was a business community. And so thanks in large part to the work done by the Littles brothers to build up the business community, it was finally decided that we should split into our own separate town. And in 1838, they petitioned the General Court of Massachusetts, and we became the town of Georgetown, completely split from Rowley, thanks to these guys. This is in Harmony Cemetery, by the way. And you can tell, people thought they were very important because that is a very tall stone. And we have John Lovering. Okay. Pull out the things, I got something to read on him. John Lovering was a wealthy fellow. He was into shoe manufacturing. He was also involved in investing. He invested in the railroads, among things, and also invested heavily in real estate. So he had a lot of money. He was also the first chairman of the first Board of Selectmen in Georgetown in 1838. But back in those days, we had our scandals. So in February 1849, the church, this is the First Congregational Church, heard a report from the Vigilance Committee, who had visited John Lovering, against whom certain evil reports. Among the charges brought against him were taking a woman who was not his wife to a hotel in Boston and occupying the same chamber with her during the night. Mr. Lovering refused to appear before the church to answer to charges, and he was excommunicated by unanimous vote. Many years later, on July 4th in 1881, with his financial affairs in disorder and suffering from a couple of weeks of sleeplessness, John Lovering, after enjoying a hearty breakfast and greeting all the neighbors as they headed into town for their 4th of July celebration, went out to his barn and hanged himself. And then finally we have Theodore Eliot. This is also in Union Cemetery, also a very tall obelisk. People thought he was pretty important. And he was one of the founders of the local anti-slavery society here in town and was very active in the anti-slavery movement. Some of the biggest names in the movement stayed at his house, including William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. His house, by the way, is on the square. It's now the Davis building, the big gray building right in the center. And his home was also a stop in the Underground Railroad. A number of escaping slaves were housed in his place as they moved on. In 1851, he caught California fever. And he spent 7 years in San Francisco. He came home for a year and a half, then returned for 7 more years. He was married, by the way, and his wife stayed in Georgetown, so it must have been a great marriage with him going for 7 years at a time. And then after that, he made biennial trips to California for many years and crossed the continent 20 times in all. And back then, crossing the continent was a whole lot more complicated than it is these days. And Mr. Eliot liked to tell stories about the struggles for law and order in California. And one newspaper article makes him sound kind of like a character that Clint Eastwood might play. It says, he was always on the side of law and order, temperance, and liberty. And if the corrupt courts of the new state did not afford protection, he was one of those that would relieve those reluctant bodies from the task of punishing criminals. Interesting guy. So anyhow, that is my talk. I was told just do like about 20 minutes or so. So that is it. You're welcome to join me when I have cemetery tours. I'm not sure when my next one is. It might be Halloween. But anyhow, I got to get in the plug. I hope you will consider joining the Historical Society. Show of hands, everybody who is already a member. I know I see a lot of members here today. Yeah, I've got quite a few of them. If you are not, I have brochures here. If you're interested in visiting our Brocklebank Museum, or if you're interested in becoming a member, we have a membership form right inside here. So feel free to pick one up on your way out. And does anyone have any questions?
How did we get the name Georgetown?
That's a good question, and nobody seems to know. There is. It appears that it was left up to the state legislature. There were a lot of things they couldn't decide on, and they sent it to the state legislature, and it appears that is one of them. But nobody can find it. There was an old rumor that the committee was named. It was made up of a bunch of men named George. That is not true. In fact, there is not a single George on the committee. So that actually came about as a kind of comical script that they wrote for the centennial in 1938, and it just kind of evolved from there into that's how it was named. It wasn't. Anyone else? Oh, come on.
On the ghost tour,
Yep.
and isn't it at night?
No, it's during the day.
I did one in Nova Scotia, and everybody carried a lantern.
Mm-hmm.
It was really interesting.
Yeah, I'm afraid people will trip. The ground is very uneven and there's some small stones, and I just thought liability-wise it probably wouldn't be a good idea. Barry?
Was Cuffy Joe a slave?
Yes, he was. It said former slave on the side. He was sold into slavery as a child, and he purchased his freedom when his owner died, which was shortly before the Revolutionary War. And he took the name Dole. And he was in the Revolution in 76, 77, and 80, so he enlisted 3 different times. Yes?
Do you cemetery in Cambridge?
No. No, I do tours right here in Georgetown. That's it. Anyone else? No? Okay, well then thank you all for coming.